Good morning, everyone, and welcome. My name is Kevin O'Malley, and I'm proud to serve as the board chair for the Washington County Chamber Partnership. And when you think about what we're here today to talk about, it is the number one reason all of your chambers of commerce are here today and part of the Washington County Chamber Partnership. So we have Beaverton, represented by CEO Alicia Burns. Welcome, Beaverton Chamber of Commerce. Is Juanita in the house yet? I know Juanita will be coming shortly from the Forest Grove Cornelius. Russ Sheldon represents the North Plains Chamber. Corey Kersley from the Sherwood Chamber. Susan Nowak is the board chair for the Tualatin Chamber. And Deanna Palm from the Washington County Chamber of Commerce. Welcome, everyone. And Tiger Chamber is going to help us. Debbie Mulhan is going to help us be the facilitator for today's panel. Thanks for being here, and I'm going to turn it over to Debbie.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us. My understanding is we have over 70 participants that signed up for this. And so again, as Kevin said, this is brought to you by the Washington County Chamber of Commerce Partnership. So all 9 chambers within Washington County are bringing this to you. We know that you have been having challenges hiring in this job market. So hopefully this panel discussion will help you get some strategies and some new ideas about how to take on that challenge. And so with that, I would like to introduce our panelists. But before I do that, I want to just do a little bit of housekeeping. So there's 2 panels. Each panel will run for about 30 minutes, and then we'll open up for about 10 minutes of Q&A. We will manage the Q&A through the chat function. So if you have a question, put it in the chat. And between Kevin and I, we will be moderating the chat, and then we will be feeding those questions to the panel. A lot of times there's questions that are very similar, so we'll be netting some of those out to feed those questions to the panel. When both panels are done, there will also be a half-hour session if you choose to stay, where we're going to break the panelists into 2 breakout rooms, and you can go and have some follow-on conversations and questions if you so desire to do that. So with that, I would like to introduce our panelists. Tom Engel. Tom, if you want to raise your hand and identify yourself. He is a principal consultant with Vantage Point HR, and it's a Beaverton human resources company with expertise in HR outsourcing, HR consulting. He has over 20 years of customer-facing professional experience in the areas of IT, human resources, and marketing, and he's worked with companies as diverse as Sage, Intel, and Providence Health and Services. Tom works with a wide range of industries to include automotive, professional services, marketing, IT, healthcare, transportation, and nonprofits. He has a bachelor's degree from Linfield College and an MBA from the University of Portland. So we're very excited to have Tom on our panel this morning. Partnered with Tom on the first panel is Eric Postma. He's a litigation, transaction, and employment attorney with Bittner and Haas. Eric got his bachelor's degree from California State University, Fullerton, and attended law school at Willamette University in Salem, Oregon. While in law school, he was the editor-in-chief of the Willamette Journal of International Law and Dispute Resolution. Eric has actively practiced in Oregon since 1999 and is also licensed to practice in California and Washington. Eric's experience is in business, real estate, and civil litigation, and it includes a broad range of cases from breach of contract actions to employment law, which will be particularly of interest today, personal injury litigation, and beyond. He also has extensive experience in advising businesses in all phases of business operations, including business entity formation, employment matters, contract negotiations, sales transactions, and vendor and customer issues. So welcome, Eric. Ashley Hill was supposed to be on panel number 2, and unfortunately, she is not able to be with us today because of a death in the family, and her offices are closed. So we send our condolences to Ashley and her family. I would like to introduce Robert Knight. Robert's going to carry the ball for the whole second panel. So thank you, Robert, for stepping up on short notice to do that. Robert is the owner with Express Professionals in Tualatin. He's owned this business for more than 26 years, and he and his team have been devoted to providing quality staffing services and human resource solutions to businesses and job seekers throughout our local community since 1989. At Express, they provide a number of staffing solutions in Tualatin for clients in Tualatin, Wilsonville, Portland, Canby, and Lake Oswego. Their solutions cover 4 principal industries, including administrative and clerical staffing, light industrial and skilled labor staffing, including things such as logistics, warehousing, and skilled trades, and professional and executive search and medical staffing. So with that, I would like to hand it off to our first set of panelists. Again, if you have questions, please put them in the chat. Tom, take it away.
Well, let's see if we can get this technology to work. So hopefully you are all seeing a title slide. Someone say yeah.
Not yet.
Not yet.
Okay.
Tom, would you stop sharing and let me try to reset it for you? Okay, standing by.
Oh yeah, that's good.
All righty, and if we could ask everybody to please mute if you're not mute yet. Here.
All right, it looks great.
Okay. You ready to go, Tom? You see it? We can see it on the screen.
Yep. All right. Thanks everyone for coming. What can you do? What should you do for hiring during COVID? Eric and I are approaching this from kind of 2 different perspectives. And here's where I'm coming from this one. A lot of times I'm running into a lot of people who are frustrated and confused about what to do in general. And that's kind of understandable. A lot of what has brought a lot of you here today is there's common question that keeps coming up. Can I require proof of vaccination for employees and candidates? And the short answer is yes, but with exceptions for medical and or closely held religious beliefs. And Eric's going to be going over some of that in more detail later on in the segment. But in my experience, this is sort of missing the larger issue that I see tripping people up. Usually there's a question behind that question, and that's where people are really confused on what to do or even how to organize their thoughts. So bottom line is people are just getting stuck. Are you okay with or do you hate conflict? Bottom line is someone's not going to be happy in this scenario, however you choose to move ahead with mandating vaccines or not. And regardless of our own facts or how persuasive you think you are, you're not going to be able to debate your way out of this maze. And ultimately, you can scour the internet all you want to and hope you find the right answer, but we're not dealing with that type of straightforward problem. It's just not that simple. The solution from my perspective, as I've been working with clients, is ultimately you're going to have to reset your point of view here. So if you're stuck, if you're spinning, you're not quite sure what to even do here. First, you've got to acknowledge and kind of wrestle with your own self-doubt, the murkiness that this question represents. And then ultimately with your goal here, you're trying to chart a path forward that helps you get unstuck, make a decision, and then act on it. So question comes up, how do you go about that? This is how I guide people through this. First one is just basic commitment. Choose to move forward on this. You got to get off the hamster wheel. Stop scouring the internet for data, information. You're going to drive yourself nuts, and it's kind of a losing proposition. There's not going to be something there that everyone's going to be happy with that is going to get you to a place that's good for you and where no one will be upset. Commit yourself to a direction with what you have. I mean, ultimately here, you've got limited information. You've got a lot of unknowns. This is imperfect. Again, it lacks simple answers. Don't waffle or avoid the topic to avoid upsetting people. I have run into clients that do this, and people are confused, they're frustrated, and doing nothing is not going to help your cause. And fair or not, you've got to understand that people are keeping score. Your team is, your future candidates, they're all going to take note about how you responded to this challenge that we're in right now, and ignoring it is going to win you respect and loyalty. Next up, it's clarity. You've got to arm yourself with some clarity to guide you through this. And this is how I guide people to frame this question. You know, you've got to have something simple, clear. If someone says, how are you keeping your people safe? You need to have a simple, clear response as to how you're going to do that. You've got to find your true north. This is where, again, I'm guiding people through this process. What you should do and why. You've got to write out what's at stake for your organization or your business. Is it customer confidence? Is it employee confidence? Is it employee health? Is it greater potential legal exposure? What about loss of key employees? Someone says, I'm out of here because you made me do this. Or I can't believe you're not taking this more seriously. I'm out of here. I'm going to go get another job. What about key skills? What if one or two people are the crux of your organization? What about the viability of the entire organization? Write out what's at stake here. This is going to help get you a bit grounded so you have a little more firm foundation moving forward. You've got to think 2 or 3 moves ahead at this point. And this is why I walk people through this. You've got to anticipate honest concerns, number 1, and people playing games with you, number 2. That's where I'm coming from here. You need to have a feeling or an opinion as to how strict you'll be regarding religious and medical exemptions that strike you as less than sincere. If you grant an exception, be prepared to cover things like testing and isolate those that test positive. You've got to stand behind and manage your real risks that are out there. We're already seeing situations along the lines of, my chiropractor signed this and I don't need to get the vaccine. What will you do if someone's natural healer does this? What if their energy consultant does this, for example? How are you going to respond to these things? How strict will you be? It's not just setting up a process. You've got a lot of latitude here. And this is where risk management comes into play quite a bit. Communication, 3rd step here. What's the best way to roll this out? You're going to make a decision. You're going to chart a path here. You know your people. Is it individuals? You know the people who are going to be hesitant. Maybe it's small groups, it's supervisors. But bear in mind, you're not just passing along information. Don't send out an email. You're setting a standard. What is the best way for this to be understood and hopefully implemented in such a way that it's least disruptive to your organization? Be prepared to listen and establish a process. You've got to stand firm while keeping an open mind. And this is difficult for a lot of people who are really searching for the answer that, again, is going to help them navigate this situation. Finally, just this last thought when it comes to recruitment. You know, obviously, we're in a tight market right now. And when it comes to how you're going to approach the market out there, attract candidates, first, make sure your requirements are clear throughout the recruitment process and your ads, the interviews, etc. The ramifications for the candidate is no different than it is with the employee. And then you've got to balance that sincere effort to tell your story and stand out from the crowd. So yes, we have these requirements. Yes, there's scarcity, but what I walk people through is you've got to ask and answer, why would someone want to work for you? Everyone's got a story, something that makes them an attractive employer. Could be that you restore classic cars. It could be that we produce the best widgets anywhere. It could be, it doesn't have to be dramatic. It doesn't have to be exotic. It doesn't have to be exaggerated. Get someone to help you tell your story. Most people don't like talking about themselves, let alone in flattering ways. And it's really difficult to do on your own. And just bear in mind, don't throw up a job description. You've got to stand out somehow. Talk to that audience as to what makes you a good employer. This is more like dating. It's not a check the box scenario, and I see a lot of clients missing that. With that, I am wrapped up, and I will turn it back to Debbie.
Thank you very much, Tom. Hopefully there's some good tips in there, and if you've got questions relative to all that, you can start putting them in the chat. And with that, I'd like to now hand it off to Eric to talk about this issue from his point of view.
Wonderful. Thank you, Debbie, and thanks, Tom. And Kevin, just as a reminder, hopefully you've got some slides there up, and you can feel free to put the first slide up whenever you want, since it's a general slide. But I do have a few things to throw out at the front end. As a lawyer, I'm always supposed to throw out this disclaimer about not legal advice, and unless we're specifically engaged, and there you've gotten the disclaimer. But this time I'm going to throw out an additional disclaimer, and Tom touched on that a little bit, which is that I want everybody to understand we're in a little bit of limbo with this question of COVID and vaccination requirements and non-vaccination requirements. There aren't necessarily any right answers in the law just yet, because some of these things just haven't come down to where there's been lawsuits and the like. But as Tom and I were talking and preparing a little bit, we wanted Tom to go first, because I think it should be clear to everybody here that the most important piece is not some of this fancy legal language I'm going to give you. The most important piece is what Tom had to talk about, and that is you need to figure out what's best for your company, and you need to have a plan. And my suggestion is write out that plan. I think it will be helpful for you as you're going through the process. But if you're thinking about liability, it's going to be helpful for you as well if you have that plan in place as well. So when you're thinking about whether or not do we have a vaccination mandate or do we not have a vaccination mandate for new hires, you really need to be thinking about what's appropriate for your business. Think about what the rest of your industry is doing. Think about your workforce, your workspace. Is there some risk involved based upon those factors, considering your industry, where they work, the people that are working for you? Tom said it before, and I guess you can hear it from a lawyer as well. Can you require vaccinations as a condition of employment under the law? Yes, you can. Can you choose not to require employee vaccinations under the law? For the most part, yes. As everybody understands, there's some new requirements coming in under OSHA. If you have more than 100 employees, the day is coming soon. We don't know when that day is yet. They're working on rules, and when they have those rules in place, you're going to have some specific dates, but we're not there yet. If you're in the healthcare field, you'll want to give it a look to see if it's going to apply to you right now. If you have any semblance of government employees around there, that will make a difference, but I'm going to assume that people on here are not government employees. Again, the big key here is that the vaccination mandate should be job related and consistent with business necessity. There are some things to think about with regard to potential liability if you choose to require vaccinations, if we're being honest, and that is some of those are going to be process-oriented issues, such as when you ask, confidential information, whether or not you accept or don't accept certain exceptions that could be seen as discrimination, and unequal treatment of employees is something you have to pay attention to in the process. But there's also potential liability if you do not require vaccinations. You may have employees that say that for some reason or another you're harboring an unsafe work environment. I would put air quotes around that. But also, if you're not following certain mask mandates or other requirements short of vaccination, there's some potential liability there. I'd love to tell you that there's a magic formula of do this and you're going to avoid liability. But I think we all understand there is no such magic formula from where we sit right now.
So your slides are ready when you are, Eric.
Okay, go ahead. Yeah, go ahead. You can stick on that first one here for a minute, and I'll let you know when we're ready with the second one there.
Okay.
Exceptions. Tom had mentioned exceptions. Let's start with this. Everybody uses the word exemptions. I try to get people away from using the word exemption. Exemption at law, at least, is an implication that somebody is permanently accepted from having to fulfill some requirement or another. I'm not a science guy, but I can tell you that in the COVID realm, there's probably very few things by which somebody would be completely exempted from getting, from being mandated for a COVID vaccination. There are a very limited number of allergies, as I understand it, and something like 5 out of 1 million people would have an allergy. So it's maybe get that word exemption out of your mind and be thinking by way of exceptions. And exceptions can be semi-permanent, but most of exceptions are going to be temporary. But one thing you need to keep in mind, and this is where, Kevin, we can go to the second slide if you could. Disabilities, the ADA is going to apply to your decision-making process if you have 15 or more employees. So keep in mind that as you're doing all of this evaluation, if somebody has what could be considered a disability that would keep them from getting vaccinated, such as immune diseases and the like, that you will have to go through this evaluation process as to whether or not you can require them to get a vaccination as a condition of employment or not. It is your task to do this. You will need to make a determination, and I have this second bullet point here that says that a workplace policy can include a requirement that an individual shall not pose a direct threat to the health and safety of individuals in the workplace. And it is the employer's responsibility to understand whether or not having somebody unvaccinated on site or requiring everybody's vaccination is addressing a direct threat to health and safety. Let's go to the next slide, Kevin. I don't want to linger on this, but these are the court factors and the administrative factors they're going to look at as to whether or not there's a direct threat, whether there's the duration of the risk, the nature and severity of the potential harm, the likelihood the potential harm will occur, and the imminence of the potential harm. I don't use those factors in order to think through whether or not somebody will or will not be hired based upon your vaccination mandate if you have one or if you don't have one. But don't linger on these. I'll just want you to understand what these factors are and that it is a moving target. It's just inevitably something I can't tell you how this is all going to work out. Let's go to the next slide. Reasonable accommodation. This is where it gets a little bit interesting. If you find out that somebody is either requesting the opportunity to not be mandated, or the reverse can be true as well. If a prospective employee has a disability that can be accommodated by ways such as remote work or leaves of absences for present employees, they should be allowed that accommodation unless it's going to create an undue burden for the company. We'll talk about undue burden here in a little bit, but I want to make sure that everybody understands that it used to be that the burden needed to only be pretty small for it to rise to this level. We find that that's increasing quite a bit. So think conservatively when you're wondering, can or should I be allowing this person remote work? Think a little bit more conservatively than you maybe had before COVID had hit. Let's go to the next slide, if we could, and talk about religious exceptions. These are kind of one of the hot topics that we're hearing about quite a bit. And Tom touched on this well, in that you need to start with a plan when it comes to religious exceptions. Create yourself a form in order to ask the questions that, that you'll want to ask, and apply it even-handedly, whatever you do. The standard here is that you must allow an accommodation when the employee sincerely holds a religious belief, practice, or observance. And that, again, is another one of those moving targets. You will want to think about your industry and your workplace in order to determine how, I guess, severely you want to stick to those sorts of, that sort of language when you're evaluating it. But there is room to operate as to how loosely you apply that and how strictly you apply that. It's going to still be dependent upon that threat analysis that we talked about before. If you can go to the next slide, again, you should be providing an accommodation to a potential employee unless it will create an undue hardship, which they define as is indicated here on the screen, which is something that is more than a de minimis or very small cost or burden on the employer. We used to think that the de minimis cost used to be in the hundreds of dollar range. I think that's a larger number these days. The easiest example that comes to mind is the things that those who need particular chairs in the workplace. It used to be that if you had to spend more than a couple $100s on a chair for somebody because of a disability, that was de minimis, the de minimis standard. Now we see people spending thousands of dollars on that. It's the same thing in the COVID environment, is that we seem to be leaning more towards the employee than the employer in this regard. So think conservatively as to whether or not the undue hardship is going to apply. So those are some of the standards you need to look at. And if we can go to the next slide, Kevin, I want to talk just a minute about the practical applications. As I started with, and as Tom had alluded to as well, whether you require vaccination for new hires or not, have a written policy in place. As a lawyer, I can never say this enough. Having these things in writing, having these standards in writing, and as according to the second bullet point, applying them even-handedly is the best way to avoid potential liability when you're talking about these process issues. One thing that we're seeing a lot of lately is that people are mishandling things like vaccination and medical information in personnel files. We are seeing that documentation in personnel files, and it should not be there. You should segregate that documentation from the standard personnel file. Understand that the Oregon definition of a personnel file does not include this information. So best practices are to keep this stuff segregated from the rest of the employment documentation you have for somebody. If you are making some decisions, whether it's talking about exceptions, frankly, if you're making the decision about whether you are or not going to have a vaccination mandate, document it. Take notes about the things that you're talking about, the things that you're considering. If you do find yourself in a position where you're talking to an administrative agency or, God forbid, a court about the decisions that you made, showing the decision-making process is going to be very important. So document everything as you go. It's very helpful. And then I want to close with talking about just the simple question of asking about vaccination. You can ask about vaccination at any time during the hiring process. This is actually new because you normally cannot and should not be asking questions about people's medical status during a hiring process. But when it comes to COVID, we seem to have found that it's okay to be talking about that in the hiring process. But I'm going to tell you that best practices says you need to be very careful about when you do it. My recommended practice for people is that, and again, Tom alluded to this as well, include it in your job posting. And we'll get to that in a second, but also maybe say something about it in the interview process. Be careful about how you do that. And then do it by way of a conditional offer. So if you can go to the next slide, Kevin. If you're going to post something on your job posting, language like this is what I'd recommend. And I'll linger on this slide for a minute so you can write it down if you need to. But essentially what you want to be saying in your posting is that letting them understand that you may have a COVID vaccination requirement if you have a COVID vaccination requirement in place. But use language like this that lets them know that if you have a valid religious or medical reason to not be vaccinated, that opportunity is going to be there. You must do that. So there's some potential language you can use in that process. If you go to the next slide, Kevin, if you're going to have a conversation, your application. If you have a question on the application, here's some potential language to use. I strongly, strongly, strongly recommend that it be a yes or no checkbox and have no space whatsoever for the applicant to put any additional information. You do not want to be inviting questions that would have them talk about their medical condition in their application. The reason being is because if you receive medical information and you choose not to hire, you could find a potential employee saying that I was discriminated against because of a disability. Next slide. I think we might be at our last one here. You can ask about it in the, you can mention it in the interview process. I suggest not asking anybody about it. Maybe mention to them in the process that they will have to submit to it if a job offer is extended, and leave it at that. Do not invite a conversation about whether or not they have any medical conditions or religious beliefs that would stop them from getting the vaccine. My biggest recommendation is that if you are going to have a vaccination requirement, you do it by way of a conditional offer of employment. Some of you may have seen these things come through in when it comes to doing other inquiries during the job hiring process, such as if you need to do some credit review or the like. So I suggest doing the same thing when it comes to COVID vaccination, which is you send a letter that says, hey, we're happy to give you the job, and use language that looks a little bit like this, which says that your next task is to provide me information with your vaccination status or start the process of getting it done. Or here's some documentation you can fill out if you have a religious belief or medical issue that prevents you from getting a vaccination. I strongly recommend the conditional offer simply because this is a known process in the employment realm for asking sensitive information and when you should ask it. You don't really want to receive anything, particularly medical information, in the hiring process until this very last stage. So do it by way of a conditional offer of employment. That's my recommendation if you are going to have a vaccine requirement, how you would go about it. You can go to the last slide if you want to, Kevin. That's really just my information. If you have more specific questions, we're going to have a question and answer period here today, but if you have more specific questions, certainly reach out to me and we're happy to talk them through with you a little bit. And I may or may not tell you that you need additional legal advice on that, but at least we can have an initial conversation and see if you need to consider it any further. So, thank you.
Thank you, Eric. There's some good nuggets in there. I took some notes because I'm going to be doing some hiring, so that's very timely. What you can and cannot do. There are some questions in the chat that I'm going to go through, and then I think I got a question in email that's relevant to this, so I'll ask that question as well. So one of the first questions in the chat is, we are consultants. Our company policy is not to mandate vaccinations. However, many of our clients who are local, state, and federal public agencies and engineering firms are requiring that our team is vaccinated. So I'm not quite sure what the question is there, but maybe like, can that be required of a consultant would be the question.
My answer to that is, again, yes, you're just going to need to figure what's best for you and your team. But the answer is, can you require it? Yes. Should you require it? I don't know. That's more of a business analysis. I don't know if Tom, if you have any different input, but that's my suggestion is that you can certainly always require the mandate. Yeah,
and where I would go with that is, yes, obviously you can. Should you? Well, how big of a client is this? Is this a small percentage of your business? Are you going to go to the mat over this one? If you primarily work with governments and agencies with standardized contracts that talk to each other, you've got a lot on the line there. So you can know, but they will probably be very swift in taking you off their approved contractor list. And you've got a business decision to make. This is one of those potentially existential threats if you choose not to comply with the request and this requirement.
Thank you both. The next question is from Dan Winecoop. This is to you, Eric. The question is the 15 or more employees, which I believe refer to the ADA exception, an FTE number or the number of people physically on the payroll?
Well, that's always an interesting question. It's mostly FTE, but if you have, I don't know what the threshold is, and we can connect offline, but if you have enough temporary employees, that number looks a little bit different. So consider it as FTEs, but if you have a lot of temporary employees, we should talk about what that other number is.
Yeah, I think in this particular industry, it's probably not temps, it's probably people that are part-time, so probably less than full-time.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, great. I think there are some more questions down here. While I'm looking at those, I'm going to give you one that came in via email. I think you answered most of the questions about when can you ask questions about COVID vaccination status of an applicant and their intent, et cetera. But the follow-on question that this person had is, beyond that, how do we determine if there's a valid medical exemption?
I'm not sure I know the answer to that question. This goes back to, and frankly, I'm going to hand it over to Tom in a moment, because the legal advice on that is that I go back to the even-handed approach. Figure out what you want to do at the front end, and go from there. My office is one example. I mean, as you can see, I'm in an office with a closed door. We have enough space here that essentially every employee here has office space with a closed door. So we don't really need a vaccination mandate. On the reverse of that, you may have multiple people who are working within 6 feet of each other constantly all day long. You're going to need to factor those sorts of things in as to whether or not they're meeting a threshold whereby you say yes or no. But again, that's why I say I hand it over to Tom on that one, because I'm more interested in making sure that you have a plan in place that's evenly administered amongst the potential applicants and your current employees. You have a different approach, Tom?
I come at this, and this is because I've thought through it, and I have a firmer opinion on this than some people, but this is a disease that is communicable and could care less about my political motivations or doubt of science, etc. So what am I going to tell, again, employees? What about the customer that says, are your people vaccinated? You've got to make a stand here somewhere. And if you're going to try to straddle a set of standards, you've got to be prepared for some blowback from that, some ramifications. So part of why I emphasize writing down what's at stake is to try to I'm trying to compel the decision makers to be really clear with themselves what is at stake for them, so that they don't have to. I don't want anyone to get into a debate. I want the decision makers to have an idea of where they stand despite the lack of clarity that we're in right now. That's how I'd approach it.
And to supplement what Tom is saying is that honestly, in those situations, I tend to coach people towards the next step in the process, which is reasonable accommodation and the like. Can you have that employee working from home or in a different scenario? If they can easily work from home, why twist yourself in knots trying to figure out whether or not that medical determination is such that they can or cannot? You just don't need to go there if you can accommodate it in a different way. So you can certainly move yourself onto that next step of the process. And Tom brought up another good point, which too is that I talked about workplace and the like, but the clientele and the interacting with your clients, and that's another potential liability as well, as to whether or not your employees might get a vendor or a customer sick as well. So there's a lot that goes into that, and if you can avoid the process of trying to figure out, not being doctors, whether or not they meet that threshold for a medical exception, see if you can move to the next step of the process and accommodate them a different way.
And that's a good point. Just because you can engage somebody doesn't mean you have to or should. If it's a factory worker, if there's a production line, different scenario than if you're dealing with professional services like an attorney. But yeah, despite having a strong opinion, just because you feel that way and can probably justify it in your own mind, don't pick a fight if you don't have to.
Thank you both. So we have another question. A couple of people asked this question in a little bit different way, but the crux of it is, can you require vaccination on new hires if you don't have a policy or a mandate for existing employees?
I'll start and then hand it over to Tom. Let me just put it this way: is that I don't think it's wise to have different policies for new hires versus current employees, but you also end up in this weird limbo because full vaccination in this world sometimes means a 6 to 8 week process. So there's certainly some understanding that it may take a couple months for current employees to get fully vaccinated. And so you can live in this world where you can require new hires to be vaccinated and then still some lag time, in my mind, before you get to full vaccination for current employees. Again, keeping in mind that reasonable accommodation process. But from a legal standpoint, I think you're playing a dangerous game if you're going to treat your new hires different than your current employees.
Yeah, and that's an inconsistency that, while it's interesting and you could maybe technically do it, it does leave some exposure. Eric's bringing that up, but also think of again, where I was mentioning people keeping score. How does this look to the outside? If someone were to look at what you were doing, would this look like what? Does it look like you have no conviction? Does it look like you're afraid? Does it look like you're not serious? It's not a pretty look if you're not consistent.
Thank you, Tom. Another question we have is, what can we and can't we ask about health status if they're already employed? For example, if we get a sick time off request, or if we know they or someone in their family is getting tested for COVID.
From a legal standpoint, give them the time. It's the safest course of action. We do still have some laws on the books that require you to provide some time if they or family members need testing or the like. I am telling people that it's best practices that if you're going to require vaccination, that you probably should allow them to do that on company time. You need to think about whether any costs associated with it are going to be covered by the employer. Again, have a plan in place and be consistent with it. That's my recommendation.
I'm thinking the wrinkle on this question might be more like, you're in a workplace, you suddenly have an employee that requests time off or takes sick time, and they're not communicating to you that maybe they've potentially been exposed to COVID, which has a ripple effect through your workplace, depending on how that employee interacted with other people in your workplace. So maybe I think that might be where it's coming from, more like, how much can you probe into, like, well, why do you need that time off? And have you been exposed to COVID? And is there something, because you could wait like 3 or 4 days to find that out, yet you would probably feel as the employer, you'd want to be notifying people that are in the, that have been in contact with that employee.
I will say this, that the cases that have been happening, and understand there's a lot more cases going on now than there have been over the last year. So it's going to get refined a little bit. But the general impetus in this whole thing is that we are allowing employers to ask this very basic question about COVID exposure and COVID vaccination of employees. But Tom's point before is the one I usually end up talking to people about, which is that it tends to be a other employee problem than the one that you specifically need to speak with. We all see that there are some people who are particularly militant about some of these things, and you need to be thinking through: is somebody else going to make an issue of this, and plan accordingly. And I wish I could tell you you're not being left with this dilemma of, should I ask this employee this and face potential liability for asking the question, versus do I not ask and then have the potential liability there. Just understand that the current impetus is that you can ask questions, limited questions about COVID exposure and COVID vaccination.
Thank you. So kind of related to that, another question is, what are the do's and don'ts for handling questions about your employees' vaccination status from other employees or customers?
I'm in the space of I'm back to the what is your clear response to how you're going to keep people safe? And notice I said all the people around you, not just your employees, but your vendors, etc. You need to be able to explain to a level of detail what you're doing. And if they keep pushing on it, you're going to have a choice to make. If you want to get into specifics as to this is our protocol, how we've done certainly your choice. But you've got both a legal liability issue and you've got a employer brand perception issue, both internally and externally there. My best advice, if I'm going to summarize this, is you've got to lean into this discomfort. You've got to do that somehow.
Yeah.
Because again, if you choose to ignore this, or you choose to try to make everybody happy, you're not going to make anybody happy, especially if things don't go well.
Tom alluded to this, and this is the advice I tend to give when those questions arise, which is it comes down to that policy that Tom had been talking about of have your plan of action in place as to how you're going to keep your employees safe and refer to that. I'm not a huge fan of sharing medical information, even if it's COVID status, from employee to employee if they're asked. But if you can point to a policy that says we are checking in with our employees on this, we know where our employee status is. You can just say that, look, here's our policy on making sure that everybody around here is safe, and we are following it to a T, and we are administering it as even-handedly as we can. That's the better answer than Sally isn't vaccinated and she's been exposed to somebody. It's hey guys, look, here's our plan. I'll email you the plan. Understand that this is what we're doing as your employers to keep our customers safe, our employees safe, our vendors safe.
Great, thank you. We do have a few more questions, but I think I'm going to hold those until we get through the next panel, and those relate to specifically the questions around religious exemptions. So be thinking about that when we come back after we're done with the next panel. So the next panel is going to focus on, so kind of changing gears here. So now we're talking about all this. We've talked about all this, like, how do we hire in a COVID world and what can we do as an employer with mandates, et cetera. Now we're going to hear from Robert about, in this tight job market, what can we do to become an employer of choice and really stand out from the crowd when we're competing for a short labor resource. So with that, I'm going to hand it off to Robert. You're on mute.
Thank you very much, Debbie. And I want to say, Tom and Eric, that was a great job. I've never had such interesting conversations from lawyers about COVID and the law in the workplace. So great job. I'm talking about winning with recruiting is what I look at it, but how to become an employer of choice. I give you a little bit of a background is I spent 13 years in manufacturing. I spent another 7 years as an executive recruiter and senior HR generalist employment coordinator. And now the last 18 years as an owner of the Express franchise in Tualatin. And so I derive the things I'm going to talk about from all those years of experience, but I don't think anything has escalated the change as much as the last 4 to 5 years. And I incorporate the change in leadership and engaging employees, and obviously the one that's called COVID. And they're significant. A friend of mine down in Arizona sent me a post, and it was a sign on a Starbucks of all places. And it said, "New schedule, we close at 11:30 due to staffing shortages." And I thought, what the heck, even Starbucks? And so it's affecting a lot of companies, not just hospitalities, manufacturing, professionals, all levels. So I'm sure all of you are having a challenge, or most of you are having a challenge with understanding how to compete, because today's market, we are competing. You're not just recruiting. And the next slide, Debbie, would be great. So just to refocus, where we are today has been brought on by a couple, what I consider two great things, is COVID. I know when it first broke out, companies were struggling to get plastic separators between employees and putting decals on the floor and all the other things. And are we going to be shut down? How bad will this get? And what that led to was holding patterns. Companies went on hold, waiting to see what would change, how would this affect them, because we just didn't know. And it was a very uncertain time. And what's interesting for me personally is I had open heart surgery in December of 2020. So I was gone for 6 or 7 months. And when I came back into the office, it was amazing to me the next thing that we were facing, which was compensation challenges and attracting the workforce we needed and our customers needed and you all needed to make your businesses move forward and thrive. So the one big one was the unemployment incentives. Not only was unemployment given in a very lax way, there was no requirements for reporting, but there was an incentive put on top of that. And there was other incentives out there with rent or mortgage, but it really gave the employees the safety they needed if they were afraid to come back into the workforce or uncertain what it was, but it became the norm. And it made it hard for companies to find talent during this time. But the real thing that happened is not only were employees unsure of how to handle the pandemic, they were afforded benefits that incented them not to work and to be safe at home, but it became the norm, an increase in pay. And for the non-exempt worker who was hovering right around the minimum wage, that incentive actually paid them more. And if you're looking for that non-exempt employee for your organization, it made it very tough to attract them. And so that's why I call it, we're not recruiting anymore. You're competing. You are competing for candidates. And the problem was the mandates started to loosen, vaccines became available, and companies started to hire. Especially we saw it in our organization, manufacturing, distribution, and customer service, and the professional levels all started hiring. Here's the problem. Everybody did it at the same time. So everybody was competing for the workforce they needed to be successful. And if everybody's hiring, the problem was minimum wages have changed, wage expectations have changed. And so companies were going to hiring, doing it the way they've always done it. But the workforce was looking for a company to recruit and hire them in a different way, to pay them more, to give them recognition, to give them flexible hours. And so this changed the way we had to go about it as companies. So the companies that responded quickly in this change, they were the winners in the beginning. And you saw that come with compensation expectations and how they changed. Some companies moved quickly. Some people put the flag in the ground and said, I'm not budging on this compensation, because it's going to cause this problem, especially, and you see down here, compression, what that would do to their compensation philosophy. So the companies that were slow to respond had challenges, but what we've seen is companies have actually stepped up. They've taken a look at their compensation strategies and they've made themselves competitive, and wages have stabilized. What we're seeing, we service between 180 and 120 clients on a weekly basis. Out of the 200 to 300 people we have working, we're going to see about a $17.50 an hour average pay rate. That's average. And those are typically for not really having a lot of requirements. Those that are having more requirements are 18 to 20, 22. So that's a big change. And I think that organizations that took the time to move quick and then also took the time to look at their compression and the challenges in this area, they became winners, and they're finding themselves a little more successful. But it's not just pay. And I think, Tom, you said it well when you said, tell the story. And the next I'm going to talk about is the process. This is a very common term. You hear it with football, you hear it with sports, you hear it like, trust the process. Well, the process is a popular term, but exactly where companies are struggling, they're struggling without even being aware they're struggling because they're not shifting their paradigm in the process of hiring. And I think this is the most critical area for all companies to really think about, because recruiting starts at the very beginning, and you have to have a commitment to filling that open in your organization. And it doesn't end until you've completed the onboarding commitment that your team has committed to, because that's what it takes today. A complete commitment by your team throughout the whole process. So let's touch base on a couple things. What's your message? Telling your story. And you think about, what are you saying in your advertisements? How does it read? What does it look like? And how far are you reaching? Today's job posting says requires, must have. Those are not effective. Too much text. It doesn't engage the new workforce. People are on their phones. Everything's quick. We all know, we look at a Facebook post, and if it's this long, we say, I'm out. I'm not reading that. I might like it though. And so remember, wording, graphics, broad exposure. And the other thing that dovetails into that, if you're going to put a posting out there, it's almost always going to lead them back to your website and your application process. What does your website look like? What does it feel like? Is it clunky? Is it hard to maneuver? Is it long? Does it take them a long time? I would tell you, if it's taking a long time, today's workforce that's looking for opportunities, they don't want to spend a lot of time in that step. One of the things we did in our office is that instead of having them go to our website, we have them directly DM us right from the ad, and we call immediately, and we'll talk about that later. So the online application is a secondary process to them direct messaging us on the process. So don't be clunky, don't be time consuming, and really look at, are you attracting or are you repelling? It's a very important thing to think about. The process continued is the recruiting part. And everybody knows that today's market is requiring companies to be timely. You can't wait a day or two in the race for talent. I can tell you, a gentleman came into my office and we were talking. I make it a point to talk to every person that comes into our lobby, every single person. And he showed me in a 2-hour period of time, he had over 20 text messages from different companies asking if he wants to interview or apply for their job. 20. And I thought, oh my gosh. And I read them all. And I was thinking, oh gosh, this is not good. And it made me aware that we have to have a better face with the people we're trying to identify and evaluate. So the most important thing I consider in my office, and I think it's the same thing for any organization that's looking to hire and make a good first impression, is have a person that's timely in the response, knowledgeable. They must know and speak to the jobs in the organization. What does this job taste like, feel like? What does it really encompass? Have them be able to speak to it. And know the why. Why does someone want to join your team? Why does someone want to work for John? We have companies that we highlight the manager because we know how good that manager is. You're going to meet Greg. Greg is an amazing leader. Working with him, and you go into detail about your organization, about the people that work there. This contact person has to be knowledgeable. And this one doesn't cost you anything. Your contact person has to be positive and it has to be upbeat. If you have someone who is just walking through the questions, 9 times out of 10, people who, if they encounter somebody who's not upbeat, not positive, they will say, yeah, I'll be there for the interview. And you know what happens? They're not there. 9 o'clock when you're waiting for them to walk in your door, I don't know why they're not here. Remember that. Positive upbeat goes a long ways to really, and it's something else Tom said is, this is dating. And you've got to, you want them to call you after that first conversation and you want them to come back and visit you. So you are competing for these people. And the person who's making the contact oftentimes can be the face and the voice. Today's environment, Teams, Zoom, you can actually call that person on that first call and get them on a line and meet with them face to face. And I know our organization's incorporating that more to the first contact we have, if we can do it. So make sure your contact person is timely, knowledgeable, positive, upbeat, and represents your organization the way you want it to be represented. Because that first impression, what's the old saying? You get one chance to make a first impression. I think another thing that's really transitioned, I know I was talking to my franchise manager and we were talking about leadership, and she said, about 6 years ago, Robert, you completely changed. And it was an interesting observation on her part because I went through a leadership program that was almost 2 years long, and it really opened my eyes to a lot of things. And so I think the next critical part for organization, look at your leadership. Hiring manager must be on board to win. And this means on board in the entire process. And if it's old school, this can be a problem. That long gone are the days, you should be lucky to have a job here. And I walked 5 miles uphill both ways in the snow to go to school. Doesn't work with today's generation. They want an engaged person. One of the most important things that your leadership can do is not only be on board, is to make time for candidates. And if the candidates feel that this time is not important, they're out. If you make them feel like you're an afterthought, they're not going to stick around. A general manager at a company that we work with in Tualatin had told me where he had just been walking in and there was a candidate waiting to meet with the supervisor. So he engaged the candidate and he brought him in and set him down into their kind of like their cafeteria area waiting for the manager, and he couldn't find him. So they were late. So the general manager went and looked for the supervisor, and when they came back, the candidate was gone. It was like a 10 to 12 minute period of time. That candidate's first impression was not what they should have left with him. So the most important thing, if they feel like it's not important, they're out. Unfortunately or fortunately, you are competing, and this competition for talent requires us almost to be a sales and marketing team for your company. You have to look at it. It's sales. It's dating. And if people don't feel important, they're not going to work for you. And they may tell you they're going to be there. Yeah, I'll be there Monday. Monday gets there, they're gone. They don't show. I hear more customers tell us people commit to an interview and don't show. People commit to starting and they don't show, or people start and within the first week they're gone with no notice. This is a reality, not only attracting the people, then you lose them after all that time and investment. Get your recruiting process on board. And the other thing I think is really important is leadership has evolved over the past 10 years, more so than I've ever seen in my career. And it requires more from managers, supervisors, and leads. We no longer can manage people. We have to engage and lead them. That does not mean you leave accountability alone by any means, but you need to lead them in what accountability means to your organization. What does it mean in your environment? And that you will help them achieve these results that you're looking from them. You'll train them, you'll inspire them, you'll support them. That's what people need, because people grow when they get that. Ultimatums don't create growth. So I think leadership, look at your leadership in your organization. I can tell you that working with companies throughout the greater Tualatin, Wilsonville, Canby areas, I could go through every city, but just the greater Wilsonville, Tualatin areas. The businesses that we have the most success with are the companies that communicate with us. The most success we have are companies that actually sit down and we hash things out. Most recently this year, we sat down with two of our most long-term companies and we met with their leadership. And what was really interesting is they put a priority and a true value on changing their process because they were failing. And at the same time, we were failing too, because we weren't helping each other get better. And these two meetings, they forever left an imprint with me of what organizations really need to do is be open-minded to change, to create an environment where people can have be happy and want to come to work. And I will tell you, it makes a big difference. And the other thing is, when you're winning, it feels good, right? And the last one there is timely with their process. If you've got a process and you're late to an interview or you don't call someone when you said you're going to call them, really hone in on your leadership, your hiring managers, your entire team that's involved. Be timely with their process. Be there on time. Walk them through for the half hour. Show them the facility, then leave them with the next person. Also, be decisive with all decisions. Yeah, well, I kind of like the guy. Well, let's look at a couple more people. No, make a decision. You have to be decisive in today's market because you've got literally a 2-day window, maybe a 2-day window. You think of how many people are looking or having a struggle finding people? Well, they're all calling them. They all are. And I think the other thing that's really important, be human. If it's important, make them feel like it's important. Tell them your story. I think that was another thing that Tom talked about. Tell them your story. Tell them your own individual story. Tell them your company's history, your company's philosophy. What's your value? And that will resonate with them. Like at Express, ours is helping people succeed. That's our short value statement. And we say it to everyone that comes in. So that's so the other part that I think is most significant as far as it's evolving and its importance to the recruitment. And, it's like, so they call it fishing, not catching. Well, they call it recruiting or they call it hiring. Well, you want to be the organization that's hiring. And onboarding is so important. And if you don't have a clear onboarding process, I would encourage you to invest the time and money, if it takes money, to developing a very good onboarding process. And so what you see here is I have onboarding. No, this is not a mistake. You have the first day and you have the first week, and they're all the same. Now your timelines might be different, but these are critical. And I want to talk through some of these a little bit. The rising star. Oftentimes supervisors or managers are too busy for that first week. How many times have we all heard that? Well, I was busy. I was in a meeting. Well, one of the things that we start talking to our customers about, who are your real top performers on your floor? Who are the top performers in your warehouse? Who are the top performers in your customer service group? Why don't you give them an opportunity to grow in the organization and be that rising star that trains them the first week, that walks them through and introduces them to different departments and teaches them about the job. That rising star person is going to have career growth, and they're going to feel important and valued, and it's going to resonate onto your new employee. I call it rising star, but however you want to do it, look at your organization. Who in your organization would be good at being that first person to spend that first day in that first week? And be planned and committed to the plan. Nothing is worse than you're committed to you make the plan and then, oh, I got to go. And this person sits there and you have them doing a menial task instead of staying with them and really working through them with the plan you made and stating what your plan is so they know what to expect. We have someone who just started in our office. We needed an additional headcount. She's a recruiting specialist, and she sits every day with our rising star and has walked through everything. She actually listens to all of her phone calls. We have a two-way system set up so she can hear the customer at the other end and our trainer at the other end. So she can hear and take in everything. The other thing about onboarding properly is diversify the experience and the people they see. I mean, you think about it. If they can see all the different departments, how they all work together, meet the different people, it will have profound effect on them to see the entire company and learn the story on a bigger scope and not just their one area they'll be working in. I remember when I worked at Tektronix, I was working on manufacturing line on graveyard shift. And this guy comes in and he's watching me work. I don't know who this guy is. And he looks at me, he goes, "Hi, I'm Joe Berger." And I went, "Hi." I go, "I'm Robert Knight." I said, I'm Robert. I was so intimidated by the guy, right? And he was the new general manager. I didn't know it. And he asked me about my job, what I was doing, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I was just engaged in conversation, thought he was an engineer or something. And then at the end of the shift, we had a big division meeting introducing Joe Berger as our new general manager. And that day just left such an impression on me. I'm like, wow, that was really cool. Take the time to have your leaders go down and say hi. It makes a big difference. So leadership, relationship building, points of emphasis for the next day, praise and communicate next. Those are all end of day discussions. How nice is it to have an end of day discussion where you walk through what they learned, what you felt they did well, what you're going to do tomorrow, what they could be prepared for, if they have any questions. It's going to give you a good sense of what that person is. And what you're eliminating is that often people in that first week, sometimes they want to run, it's that fight or flight. And I remember when I first came to Express, I was a factory worker and now all of a sudden I was wearing a tie. And I think the first 3 weeks I wanted to quit every day because no one was taking time with me. I was overwhelmed with fear. Not only was I a single dad, I had the fear of this new job and I literally wanted to run. And if you have an end of day discussion, you're going to reduce that flight reaction. And someone's actually going to see this as an interesting and long-term prospect for their career. And the close. I would encourage all organizations to look at a couple things. What is your brand? How do you engage? And what's the quality of your onboarding? I think it's some of the most important things you can do to make yourself competitive in this changing world of recruiting and hiring. The other thing is it retains your most valuable resource, the human resource. Great organizations shift to the needs of the market. Your market is shifting, and it's critical to make the adjustment that you're going to need to compete and win in this market. In our business, the most valued relationships are those we communicate with. I would encourage you, look at your process. And the other one is look at your metrics. What is your recruiting costs? How about your source performance? You're posting this position in a lot of places. Where are you getting your biggest return on investment? I can tell you at our organization, 80% of all our candidates come from referrals. And we don't even have that big of an incentive for it. We offer $100 with no limit. But it's often how we get the biggest return on our investment. And why? What we invest in our office with their experience makes them want to refer their friends. And if we place them at good companies that do these things, they like working there, and then they tell their friends. So the person you hire who goes through a really good process, they're your next recruiter. And so source performance, candidates, internal, time to fill, measure your time to fill. How much is it costing you? We have a customer that was losing over 6 figures a month because they were missing 5 people on a production line. Think of that. When he sat down and showed me these numbers, I was like, wow. So not having the right people in place in a timely fashion might be costing you more than you're aware of. And the other thing is measure your retention, because retention is a prime indicator of a problem. It's kind of like when I had open heart surgery. Being out of breath was a symptom. I just had a bigger problem. And, you know, at the end of the day, I think that these are very simple. They're come from a lot of experience, and it's not complicated, and anyone can do it.
Thank you very much, Robert. Those were some, you're right, hiring has definitely changed, and the expectation of the candidates has definitely changed. So we have some questions for you in the chat. One is, I know this comes from a salon owner, so she works in her business daily as like servicing clients as well as running the business. And her question is, do you have any advice for small businesses that time is difficult to find in terms of trying to find that time to recruit, follow up with candidates, et cetera?
It's a great question. And so, and now I'm going to give you the quote, and then I'll tell you what I think. You know, if it's important to you, make time for it. If it's not, you won't. But if I was a small business owner, I would literally spend my time after hours recruiting. And the reason I say that, many people that are working are also looking for work. And when are you going to get a hold of them? After hours. Also, when you make an after hours phone call to somebody, what are you telling them? This is important. I'm really looking to find a good person. And nothing's more valuable than those two things.
Very good point. Hadn't thought about it from that perspective. I always view it after hours phone calls.
You know, when I was an executive recruiter, you know, it's funny, my son used to hate it, but I would sit there and cook dinner and talk to candidates all night long on my little Bluetooth. I had a Bluetooth thing in there that blinked blue, right? I was pretty cool back then. And, but I talked to most of my candidates after hours.
Very cool.
And,
Okay,
and
so
also look to recruit from your competitors.
that's a good point. So another question, this one's a kind of different angle. Are there particular perks which increase recruiting success, such as offering pet insurance or legal clinic access?
Wow, you know, this is interesting. I feel like having Eric answer this that way, or Tom that way, I won't get in trouble. So, you know, what's really interesting about this, perks, I think they're great. Like in my office, I offer a gym membership. Very flexible timing. I think that they were, you know, Eric or Tom was talking about when someone wants to, they think they got COVID and they need to leave during work hours, let them go, be flexible. But I honestly believe that the greatest perk is your organization. Because at the end of the day, pet sitting, you know, all these other things, the perk is your organization. That's where they're going to wake up and want to go every day. So I think perks are great. And like mine, I believe in fitness. I believe in commitment to it. So I have gym memberships. We buy lunches. We do coffee, many different things. But perks can be a very personal thing, and I would encourage you to do it. But the perk of having a great company is more important.
Yeah, and from my experience, the biggest mistake employers make of any size is you assume that you know what people want, and if you genuinely forget to ask, just ask them what their benefit, what do you value, what do you not value, and you'll be surprised what you'll get. Some people don't care about health insurance. Doesn't make sense to me, but I'm not the audience in question. So,
No, Tom, that's a great point, Tom. What he just said, I should have said it, but just ask them.
yeah, don't assume, ask. Just because the standard has been XYZ for however many years, different groups don't value the same things that maybe you do.
Yeah, like nobody uses my gym membership stuff. I don't know why.
Okay, so there's a general question, Robert, about whether or not you'd be willing to share your slides that you've been going through, like the slide deck.
Show me the money. No, I'm kidding. Sure, I'd be more than happy to.
Okay.
You know, I will tell you one thing. My company, my team, not just me, everybody that works for me can sit down with an organization and go through this process. And if you'd like anyone to give you a reference on how it helped them, I'd be more than happy to share that. But we sit down and we take this serious because my business is more successful if your business is more successful. And you know, well, the other thing about our company is we do every day what you do once in a while. That's all we do. All we do is recruit. We identify, evaluate talent for organizations. That is it.
What I like about what Robert's saying beyond the specifics, it's the conviction. You know, if you're latching on to the specific things he's mentioning, that's not wrong, but it works because he believes what he's sharing with us. And that's the barrier I run into with a lot of business owners. They're unsure, and that's okay to be unsure, but if you can get somewhere closer to where what he is sharing with us now, that's the prize as far as I'm concerned.
I couldn't agree with you more. It's, you know, helping people succeed may be the express value statement, but the mission statement is helping good people find good companies and helping good companies find good people. It's a very simple thing. We rarely talk about money in my business. We talk about people. And I think that goes a long ways with setting up our mindset every day. Does it help people succeed? Yes, is the answer. If it doesn't help people succeed, it's a no.
And I'm going to reiterate what those guys had to say too. I mean, when we do these sorts of panels, the legal questions get very interesting, but I mean this very sincerely, is that if you want to avoid liability, listen to what Tom and what Robert are telling you. You know, disgruntled employees are the ones that make the complaints, and avoiding that disgruntled employee is more about what Robert and Tom are telling you than what I am. Sure, you need to have the processes in place and the like, but good companies, well-run, good policies in place, good people, and letting them know that you care and you're listening is drastically better than anything you can have myself or any other attorney do for you in order to avoid problems and liabilities for your company. So listen, I know people may have questions in the legal realm, but listening to what those two are telling you, and Ashley, who's not here as well, getting good people like that involved in your process is going to be a critical piece.
Yeah.
Thank you. So a couple questions. These are kind of in the same vein. So what are some ideas for sources to post jobs and cast a wider net to attract candidates? And are there new websites other than Indeed and LinkedIn to post jobs?
There are. And I think the question you got to ask yourself, what do you have budgeted for recruiting? How many dollars can you put out there? But the other thing is understanding what's the most effective. So like we use local community job boards. It's free. We post 100% of our jobs there. The Oregon Employment, WorkSource Oregon, it's another one. It's free. They'll actually do some screening for you. I would encourage it. your own workforce. It's free. And if you're creating an environment where people enjoy to work, who doesn't want to work with their friends? I mean, really? LinkedIn is getting more expensive all the time. And it's not really a good resource for the non-exempt level worker you're looking for. I think that Indeed and ZipRecruiter are well positioned, but they're also getting more expensive. I mean, the costs for recruiting are going up. It's what's the old thing, supply and demand. And so you're seeing prices go up, and the price for us to do what we do has gone up considerably because we're an ISO 9000 certified company. So our recruiting costs have fixed. Everyone gets a background check. Everybody gets a drug screen, and we do not cut corners on that. Not ever. 100% of everybody who walks in gets all those things done.
Thank you.
And your chambers of commerce, by the way, they're a great resource. I think they
Most
should
of us have job boards.
exactly that aren't used very often.
Yes.
But that's a good point too, which is your best network is usually your own. I mean, it's one thing. Yeah, I use Indeed on the rare occasions that I recruit for a client, but I always tell clients, talk to your network. Who do you know? Who do you think is good? You're more likely to get a good fit through that. Then if you strike out, then go out to the general public.
Yeah, you think about the hair salon owner. Great question. But like at 3 o'clock today, I'm going to get a haircut. And if I know she's got an opening, I might say, hey, so how you feeling here? I know someone who's looking for someone.
Right. Good point. Okay, I think that's all the questions on the recruiting topic I've seen. So I'm going to pop back since we got a couple 3 minutes here before we go into.
Can I just offer one bit?
Yes.
I think there was a part I talked about leadership. And I think one of the biggest struggles I see with a company is when they have the wrong fit in that recruiting leadership role. And you often hear, well, he's been here for 20 years. Well, that's just the way Sam is. But that's often the biggest difficulty they have is shifting who that point of contact is for hiring to create a better result. It doesn't mean they're no longer the leader. It just means they may not be involved at the highest level of the recruit, attract, identify, evaluate, and hire. And so for business owners, small or large, if you're looking at your onboarding processes, that might be one of the more difficult decisions you have to make.
So I'm going to ask this last question I warned you guys about before we then set up the breakout rooms. So this question goes back to the whole vaccine mandate and exceptions or exemptions, depending on how you want to look at it. So I'm going to combine the two together. So with religion being a touchy topic, is there appropriate proof of religion that you can ask for? And then the follow-on question was also, can you ask for a reference from the religious organization leadership, like a pastor, priest, or a rabbi?
Hi, Eric.
Yeah, it sounds like I get the sense this is going to be punted to me. I'll start, but I want to leave Tom the opportunity to provide some practical on that too. Keep in mind what I mentioned the standard is before, and that is whether or not the potential employee sincerely holds a religious belief, practice, or observance. Can you ask for something from a pastor or religious leader? Yes, but is that going to answer the question for you that is at issue, whether or not they sincerely hold the belief? So I've seen it done both ways, but that's what you're after. But it shouldn't be looked at in a vacuum. Again, you still should be looking at it about the safety and the entirety of your workplace and the like, and where you land on some of those questions is going to be dependent upon what your work situation looks like, contact, other safety issues. I have seen a lot of religious exemption forms that are just prompting the questions, questions like I just pulled up one or two anticipating this is explain why you feel like you should have a religious exception. Asking them to describe the principles of their religious beliefs that get in the way of them being able to get the vaccine here. Understand maybe asking them whether or not their religious beliefs are such that it is against all vaccines or just particular ones. Those are some of the questions that I see pop up. It should be a little bit specific to you and your needs, but those are the questions that I see more frequently than please have a religious leader within the organization you're a member of provide me more information. Tom, I don't know if you have any other thoughts on that.
Well, I agree with you. I think it's going to be interesting. Either you're going to feel that this is a sincerely held religious belief, or you won't. Yeah. When I advocate keeping an open mind, you may come across some faith practices that are very foreign to you, but are practiced in earnest. And so you're going to get an answer one way or the other. The question is, what do you do with it at this point? If you find out that somebody comes from a religious background that eschews, traditional medicine, and okay, now what? So how do you? It's sincere. Do you have the opportunity to accommodate somehow? Are you going to work from home? Is that possible? Oh, it's a factory job. Is that going to work? It's not about poking holes in their faith so much as, now that you have this information, what is your next potential move? Is this a reasonable risk? Am I going to test them every week, for example? I'm back to the whole risk mitigation piece there as well. And you're going to have to make a call ultimately. So take the example of someone you believe has a sincerely held belief and someone you think is just pulling your chain. It's almost, what are you going to do either way? Are you going to try and accommodate them? Can you or not? How are you going to contain that risk? How are you going to mitigate an exposure situation?
And Tom brings up a good point that I'm glad he circled back to, which is that keep in mind that if you give somebody a religious exemption, there are other things that you can do as well. You can subject them to some semblance of testing with some frequency. You can, move them away from other people. Again, can you accommodate them a different way? Can they work from home? Can they do something different? So yes, I mean, we tackled that question a little bit of, and I think Tom's right. You're just going to have to make a judgment call on some of these things, but keep in mind, then there's another step, which is okay, what do I do with this person if I say yes versus if I say no? And the policies that you have to within the workplace are going to be a big factor in, can they work from home? Can I put them in an office where they're away from other people so it's mitigating that risk? Those are the sorts of things you need to factor into.
And I agree with Eric about writing down what your kind of discernment process was. If something blows up, and Eric's my attorney, he's in a much better position, correct me if I'm wrong, Eric, if someone says, I was discriminated against because I'm part of a protected group, and I can go to Eric and say, Eric, this is how we arrived at this conclusion. It's a lot harder for them to to beat through that barrier than if I said nothing and they get to describe the narrative in the worst possible light. And then he's in a situation where he's trying to figure out how much exposure do I have here? How hard are they going to push? The chess game ensues, or the poker game, or whatever you want to call it. So if I can arm him, not with every little detail, every word I use, if I can arm him with, this is what we did and how we did it and why we did it, he can defend my interests a lot better than if I just kept it all in my head because I was busy.
It's nice to hear somebody other than myself saying document, because that is absolutely true. If you can give, if you have to revisit this after the fact and you can provide a roadmap of your decision-making process, the goal here is to show that you're not discriminating against this person because they provided some information with regard to a religious belief. What you want to be in a position to say is no, these are the factors that we actually considered. We didn't base our decision based upon on them having disclosed the fact that they have this particular religious belief. We made our decision based upon the fact of they're working in close proximity with others, and we can't do anything about it. We made this decision because they work in an office that's 50 feet away from everybody else. They can shut their door, and we can require them to wear masks when they're outside of their office. If you're documenting those sorts of decisions, those sorts of factors in your decision-making process, you are arming people like myself who may need to defend that decision for you in the future. So